By the power vested in me, I hereby constitute this assembly as a legal congregation of the University of Pretoria. During this assembly, degrees and diplomas with all associated rights and privileges will be conferred and awarded to the candidates whose names appear on the program. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, we now request you to join us in silent prayer or meditation to give thanks for the achievements of our students. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure as Chancellor of the University of Pretoria to extend a hearty welcome to you at this graduation ceremony this afternoon. I wish to welcome in particular the Dean of the Faculty, Professor J. Pillay, Assistant Director, Department of Enrollment and Student Administration, Mr. D. Sonepo, the chairpersons of schools, heads of departments, directors, honorary professors, and other lecturers and their spouses, the representative of the Student Representative Council, who will present the SRC Academic Honorary Colors, persons to whom degrees will be awarded this afternoon, of course, all the spouses and other parties, as well as dignitaries we may not be aware of. You are all welcome to this afternoon graduation. As Chancellor of the University, I wish to extend a few words of encouragement and congratulations to these graduates this afternoon. I join your parents, friends, and relatives on this joyous occasion. We congratulate all of you on your achievements. Obtaining a university degree should not be taken for granted. Those who have the support and discipline to persevere still constitute a small percentage of the population. Therefore, we have every reason to be grateful and celebrate your achievements. I salute the Dean of the Faculty of Theology and staff for another successful year, especially for the record number of PhDs that are receiving their degrees this afternoon. It's really an exceptional achievement and is highly appreciated. The Vice Chancellor, I also congratulate the Vice Chancellor and the executive leadership of the university for ensuring that a conducive environment for teaching, learning, and research is nurtured and maintained and sustained. Ladies and gentlemen, on Saturday, 23rd March, I had the privilege of attending and officiating at the installation or inauguration of Professor Coupe as the 13th Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria. It was an exceptionally dignified and enjoyable occasion, well attended by the university community and key stakeholders, leaders of sister universities, business leaders, and representatives of our government. The university stakeholders delivered warm messages of support and good wishes. Of course, the most enjoyable thing was the choirs. The choirs and the orchestra rendered a exceptionally good performances and made us all proud. I'm pleased that the university community has made another excellent choice following the very successful Professor Cheryl Dillery, who had the right experience, disposition, and temperament to lead the university during the Fees Must Fall campaign. Again today, join me in congratulating Professor Coupe and wishing him great success during his term as Vice Chancellor and Principal of this great institution. May we give him a round of applause. Later the same week, on the 29th March, the university launched another prestigious project, the Future Africa Institute, on this campus, a very innovative initiative that is the first of its kind, not only in South Africa, but also in Africa and the world. A multidisciplinary center that is going to place the University of Pretoria and South Africa at the center of knowledge production for the 21st century. Through this center, the University of Pretoria will attract exceptionally talented researchers from the rest of the continent and play a leading role in the production of new knowledge and crafting solutions to some of Africa's intriguing challenges. For you as graduates, the Institute will open new opportunities to collaborate with scholars from the rest of the continent and abroad. Through the Future Africa Institute, Africa's contributions to knowledge over the centuries will be showcased to the rest of the world, and through collaborative multidisciplinary research, African scholars will ensure that Africans become co-creators of the fourth industrial revolution, not only spectators and users of inventions, as the case was in earlier revolutions. You are also graduating at a time when South Africa is at a crossroad. The euphoria of the Rainbow Nation, founded on one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, got derailed by state capture and corruption in the last 10 years. 10 years before Ramaphosa took over. This damaged our international prestige as a nation and self-confidence as a people. Fortunately now, we are climbing out of that nightmare. Through the commissions of inquiry, we are cleansing ourselves, and our new president is giving us hope of a new dawn. As the graduates of the University of Pretoria, you should commit to making your respective contributions in the rebuilding of our country. Be ambassadors of hope and healing, agents of healing of fellow South Africans who got hurt by the scourges of corruption, hatred, racism, and xenophobia in the last few years. Let us be the new South Africans that President Mandela imagined in 1994. The Africans that President Mbeki imagined in his historic speech on the acceptance of our new constitution in 1996, when he said, "Whatever the setback of the moment, nothing can stop us. However improbable it may sound to the skeptics, Africa will prosper." As educated people in this country, that's what we should say. However improbable it may sound to skeptics, South Africa will prosper. I am sure that during your years at the University of Pretoria, you have been preparing and equipping yourselves to do good with your knowledge and skills. Now the time has come to go out and do exactly that. Ladies and gentlemen, once more, congratulations to the graduates and a big thank you to all the parents, friends and relatives for their support over the years. May we give the graduates a big round of applause. It is now my pleasure to request the Dean to introduce to me the candidates whose names appear in the program.
Mr. Chancellor, the supervisors or the duly appointed persons will now introduce the doctoral candidates.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Christo Renier Bernardi, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled A Church After God's Heart, Discerning a Missional Ecclesiology for the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, prepared under the supervision of Professor Nelis Niemand. In his thesis, the promovendus contributes to the development of a missional ecclesiology for the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. This was done by answering the following two questions. What does the current context of the DRC look like? And is the missional ecclesiology of the Church sufficient to guide the Church in being a sign, instrument, and foretaste of the kingdom? The research was framed by an analysis of philosophical influences on the DRC as well as contextual changes. A theological framework was developed that describes the contours of a missional ecclesiology. The framework was formed by analyzing ecumenical literature, the development of the DRC's theology, and the Fresh Expressions movement. This framework was used in evaluating the decisions of the DRC on missional ecclesiology from 1990 until 2013. The research was hermeneutical, correlational, critical, and theological, using literature study as well as qualitative deductive analysis. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Christo Renier Bernardi with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Johannes Paul Bester, who has complied with the requirements of the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Een NLP modelleringsproces vir gemeenteontwikkeling en begeleiding, prepared under the supervision of Professor Johan Meilan. In his thesis, the promovendus investigated the possibility of bringing OSMA's 4 questions of practical theology into the conversation with the modeling process of neuro-linguistic programming. With the help of neuro-linguistic programming theories and techniques, pastors and facilitators are enabled not only to determine what is presently happening with a specific congregation. This modeling process is a useful tool that enables congregations in understanding themselves as well as the context of the congregation, and seeks, in conversation with Scripture and the founding documents, new ways to respond to the current challenges and journey towards a more missional and sustainable congregational model. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree, Doctor of Philosophy, with all associated rights and privileges, on Johannes Paul Bester. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Sheila Shambaruka, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled The Messian Jesus and National Healing, Peace and Reconciliation in Zimbabwe, 2008 to 2017, prepared under my supervision. In her thesis, the promovenda traced the post-independent Zimbabwean political history, which is characterized by related to Kukarundi as ethnic cleansing or genocide in Matabeleland and Midland provinces in 1982, the fast-tracked land reform of 2000, Urumbasvina Operation Cleanup in 2005, and the election-related violence from 2008 to 2013. These events, it is argued, have necessitated a call for national healing, peace and reconciliation in Zimbabwe. In her study of Matthew's Gospel, she concludes that the Messian Jesus' ethics of love, peace, non-violence and forgiveness are partially applicable to Zimbabwe's need for peace, non-violence and forgiveness. She also indicated that the full implementation of these ethics faces difficulties because of challenges posed by a lack of confession, truth-telling, transformative justice and gross political intimidation and torture in Zimbabwe. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Sheila Wimbai Shambaruka with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Vittoria Armando Cifece, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis, Youth Ministry in Mozambique, a practical theological evaluation, prepared under the supervision of Professor Yolanda Dreyer. In her thesis, the promovenda investigated the plight of vulnerable youth in post-Civil War Mozambique. The Civil War left many children and young people parentless, homeless, illiterate, hopeless, and living in conditions of poverty. HIV, AIDS, malaria, and the practice of child marriage profoundly affect the quality of life of young people. The study focused on the field of youth ministry in order to evaluate the contribution of faith communities to the alleviation of the situation and the empowerment of young people. The strategies of a specific church were evaluated. The study recommends improvements and makes suggestions as to how available resources can be expanded in cooperation with the government to improve current conditions. The objective is equal opportunities for young people and the inclusion of youth in leadership and decision-making processes at all levels. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Victoria Amando Chifeshe with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations, ma'am.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Andorette Marcel Truiter Hill Jowett, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled The Experience of Loss in the Adoption Triad, a Narrative Pastoral Perspective. It was prepared under my supervision. In her thesis, the promovenda investigated by means of qualitative narrative pastoral interviews the loss experienced in the adoption triad. Interviews were done with 4 families in which adoptions took place. In the interviews, various issues became apparent. Their lives might have been, there was guilt on the side of the biological parents. The adoptees wondered how they and their lives might have been had they not been adopted. The loss of biological and genealogical connection also became apparent. The adoptive parents experienced the loss of their own biological continuity as a result of infertility. In contrast to this, there was also a theme of hope and inspiration to be found through faith in God. All these issues and more highlight the importance of working with experienced counselors before writing a new chapter in the narrative of the adoption triad. Mr. Chancellor, I request you now to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Andorette Marcel Truiter Hill Jowett. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Ilse Janssen, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis entitled Proverbs 31:10-31, a contextual reading prepared under my supervision. In this thesis, which is an exegetical study of Proverbs 31, explores the noble woman as a personification of wisdom and an example of how modern women can accomplish various tasks by approaching it from wisdom. The study demonstrated that the context in which women live and strive for change is not limited to their own communities, but constitutes a worldwide phenomenon. The uniqueness of this study is in the contribution that it makes to an understanding of feminism, feminist theology, womanist theology, womanism, liberation theology, and black theology. The promovenda addressed the question of what happens to the interpretation and application of the text if it is read from the perspective of a northern Sotho Bosadi woman. The study is concluded that the woman portrayed in Proverbs 31 is not a real woman, but an ideal that women across race and culture can strive to be. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Ilse Janssen. Congratulations, ma'am.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Derek Gary Kamakumba, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy, with a thesis titled Mission as Creation of Godward Culture, God's was mandate to Adam, Abraham, and Jesus, prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the providers demonstrated that redemption is not at the center of a mission. Creation of a Godward culture is. God's purpose for creating humankind was that humans should create a culture in which God is the source and the final purpose. With the desk research as his methodological approach and using the biblical narratives, he demonstrates that mission can be defined without reference to redemption. He defines mission as the purpose of one's being, thereby liberating mission from a redemptive connotations. With this definition, mission is to be found in all four major divisions of the biblical narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. He concluded that Adam, Abraham, and Jesus each mark a different phase in God's creation history, and each was called into being with the mandate of creating God's word culture. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Derek Gary Kamukwamba. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Gertrude A. Kapuma, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Widowhood within the Malawian Context, a Pastoral Care Model, prepared under the supervision of Professor Maki Masangu. In her thesis, the promovenda makes a unique contribution in the field of practical theology, specifically in pastoral care and counseling. It also challenges the patriarchal system of Malawi to restore the dignity of widows and give them the respect they deserve after the death of a husband. The promovenda further challenged the church for being silent in the challenges that widows go through in terms of pastorally caring for them in order to restore their dignity as beings created in the image of God, who loves and cares for them. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Gertrude Kapuma. Congratulations, ma'am.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, I introduce to you Fundiswa Amanda Owo, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled A Humanistic Dialogue with the Black Theology of Liberation in the 21st Century. Prepared under the supervision of Professor Wiane vellum. In her thesis, the Provender explored possible contours of dialogue between Black theology of liberation and humanist theology for the liberation of fragmented Black humanity. She posited that, like race, class, patriarchal violence is equally a fragmenting evil for a comprehensive liberation of Black humanity, especially its tendency to elude Black male theologians. Black theology of liberation, she argues, need to constantly and critically examine its own complicity in violence against women by debunking anthrocentric philosophy and theology. Humanist, a philosophy and epistemology of the lived experience of Black women's bodies, critical of Eurocentric epistemological frameworks of feminism, works together with Black theology of liberation as the westernizing discourse for the comprehensive liberation of Black humanity in the 21st century. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Fundiswa Amanda Gobo. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Joachim Quaramba, who has complied with all the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled A Practical Theological Perspective on Female Leadership in a Pentecostal Environment in Zimbabwe. In his thesis, the thesis was prepared under the supervision of Professor Dreyer. In his thesis, the promovendus investigated the role of women in the Zimbabwean Pentecostal Christian faith communities, which has been subject to a patriarchal and masculine environment, as well as to African cultural systems. He analyzed the prevalent theological discourse with regard to the status of women in church leadership and how this functions in the AFM in Zimbabwe, the oldest Pentecostal church in Zimbabwe. To this end, the church's constitution was reviewed with the aim of identifying how women's role was seen and how it functioned in relation to that of male persons. Using the phenomenological, historical, cultural materialist, and theological methodologies as the theoretical framework of his qualitative investigation, he concluded that traditional ideologies and culture influence the reading, interpretation, and application of the Bible, affecting how the sexes view and relate to each other. Mr. Chancellor, I request you now to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Joachim Quaramba. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Frans Johan Nicolaas Mathieu, who has complied with the requirements of the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Cyber Cemeteries as a Challenge to Traditional Reformed Thanatological Liturgical Practice, prepared under the supervision of Professor Cas Weppener. In his thesis, the promovendus explored ritual liturgical expression in cyberspace using network ethnographical methods in the context of cyber cemeteries. Various Facebook pages and the memorial website of Chester Bennington served as the primary thanatechnologies used in the analysis. Other key concepts that informed this thesis include liminality, the network culture, and post-mortal society. It was found that ritual liturgical expression in cyberspace was strongly influenced by the narratives of the individuals in encoding and decoding their bodies as they moved between the dimensions of cyberspace and corporeal space. Based on his finding, the concept of the storied body was developed to challenge the traditional historical notion of a physical embodiment in the context of a ritual. Further, it was found that the narratives of bereaved individuals and communities served as a primary catalyst in the creation of sacred space in cyberspace, once again challenging traditional notions. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Franz Johann Nicholas Mati. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Celeste Momberg, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Women as Authoritative Witnesses of Christ in the Ministries of Jesus and Paul, a social critical perspective for the Dutch Reformed Church, prepared under the supervision of Professor Gert Steyn. In her thesis, the promovenda investigated the authoritativeness of the witnesses of women involved in the ministries of Jesus and Paul, comparing it with the current state of the authoritativeness of the witnesses of women in the Dutch Reformed Church. The thesis argues that since it is the case that the witnesses of women in the New Testament were valued as authoritative on their own and equal to that of men, the Dutch Reformed Church should follow suit. The Church must, for once and all, accept the witnesses of women in the ministry as authoritative. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Celeste Momberg. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Thomas Munengwa, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Vicarious Suffering in Old Testament Wisdom Literature, a Traditio-Historical Approach, prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the promovendus investigated the relationship between the concept of vicarious suffering and Old Testament wisdom literature, using the traditio-historical approach. He argued for the presence of the concept of vicarious suffering in Isaiah 52:30-53:12, and investigated the relationship of this pericope with Old Testament wisdom literature and tradition. He determined that vicarious suffering in Isaiah 52:30, 53:12 is formulated and expressed through a considerable number of words and phrases found in Old Testament wisdom literature, and that it is informed by the concerns and assumptions found in Old Testament wisdom literature, namely that of just retribution and the suffering of the innocent. In the light of this, the promovendus concluded by recommending openness to the sovereignty of God or the fear of the Lord in the face of the suffering of any kind. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Thomas Monengwa. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Kudukwashe Musa, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Religion and Ecology, Climate Change Between Christian and Shona Religious Beliefs and Practices, prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the promovendus investigated the relevance of religion in the climate change mitigation debate. Using comparative studies and phenomenology as methodological approach, he concluded that if the world is to take necessary actions to address the causes and impacts of climate change in an effective and definitive way, religious considerations must be taken into account. The role of religion in issues of climate change and environmental conservation hinges on religious functions in society, ethical teachings, and religion's ability to inspire its adherents to adopt environmentally friendly attitudes to its nature. Religion plays roles in encouraging, sustaining, and engendering lasting solutions for the environment, and it has capacity to provide social capital and foster relationships to enable vulnerable communities to collectively achieve climate change mitigation goals to save the environment for posterity. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Kudukwashe Musa. Congratulations.
Chancellor, I introduce to you Joel Uju Lisa, who has complied with all the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Pastoral Care for Nigerian Migrants in South Africa, and it was prepared under the supervision of Professor Masangu. In his thesis, the promovendus proposed an analytical framework for understanding the marginalization, social economic exclusion of Nigerian migrants. Pastoral care and counseling models were proposed to assist migrants who suffered post-traumatic stress disorder to regain wellness. The study also recommended a model of having pastoral care providers and counselors collaborate with corporate organizations and relevant organs of state in order to tackle immigrant or immigration-related issues. Mr. Chancellor, I request you now to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Joel Uju Olisa. Congratulations, man.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Tabe Janet Odop Ospe Binoni Wang, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Initiation Practices Among Ijakham Cameroonian Women and Patriarchy, a Humanist Perspective, prepared under the supervision of Professor Guyane Velem. In her thesis, the providers investigated by means of a critical historical evaluation the reasons for the persistence of the practice of female genital mutilations among the Ghanaian community of the southwest region of Cameroon, using humanist perspective as her main methodological interventions, which address the practice in relation to Western sexual epistemology. She concluded that patriarchy and its control of women's sexuality is not a motivation for the practice of female genital mutilation in the Ajakham community, and that the clitoris is not the sole organ for female sexual pleasure as propounded by the second-wave feminists and subsequent feminist theorists from the mid-20th century onward. Their unsolicited intervention into cultural practices, as well as labeling, is seen to play an immense role in provoking the genital mutilations problem in the global south, especially in Africa. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Tabe Janet Odop Apsi Benoni Wang. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Reverend Rayo Park, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis entitled Blessed Are the Children Killers, a canonical approach to Psalm 137, prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the promovendus investigated by means of a canonical exegetical study how the theme implication of Psalm 137, namely, blessed are the killers of infants, can be interpreted in thematically related Old Testament passages that contain the themes of the psalm. By reading the psalm both in the literary context of the Psalter and the Old Testament passages that contain the same implication of infants' death, he concludes that the psalmist's implication is not contrary to the broader message of the Psalter and the Old Testament. The psalmist's implication is rather based on the prophetic message of God already spoken through the Old Testament prophets. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Rue Park. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Daniel Sakite, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Matthew's Version of the Lord's Prayer in the Ghanaian context, prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the promovendus explored the Matthean rendition of the Lord's Prayer in the context of Ghanaian cosmology. He employed the sociolinguistic, comparative, and mother tongue hermeneutical methods to render the Lord's Prayer text in Matthew from the source language Greek to the receptor language and assessed the relevance of the Lord's Prayer for the Ghanaian Christian today. He then concluded with the development of a new commentary on the Lord's Prayer. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Daniel Sakite. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Roelof Petrus Gerhardus Koeman, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis Post-apartheid veteranen se soeke na afsluiting, 'n auto-etnografische pastorale benadering, prepared under the supervision of Professor Yolanda Dreyer. In his thesis, the promovendus developed guidelines for pastoral care and counseling with post-apartheid veterans in search of closure. An auto-ethnographic method was used, and the relevance of such an approach for pastoral care and counseling was illustrated. The study found that sharing their narratives and experiences with one another plays a significant role in the search of post-apartheid military veterans for meaning, personal healing, and closure. The study showed that effective pastoral care can facilitate personal and social transformation and meaningful reintegration into society. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Roelof Petrus Gerhardus Koeman. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you V.S. Koeman, who has complied with the requirements of the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled The Parable of the Lost Son, the Economy of First Century Palestine and the Hearers of Jesus, prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the promovendus analyzes the parable of the lost son in Luke 15:11-32 against the socio-economic background of first century Palestine. The specific focus of the thesis is Luke 15 verses 11-13, and the promovendus makes use of the socio-scientific exegetical approach to identify the cultural scripts embedded in the parable and to avoid as far as possible an ethnocentric and anachronistic reading of the parable. With Luke 15, 11 to 13 as focus, the thesis pays specific attention to the younger son's decision to take up his inheritance and leave the household. The conclusion reached is that the parable, as employed by the Lucan Jesus, teaches wisdom regarding the waste of economic resources. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree, Doctor of Philosophy, with all associated rights and privileges on Wenzel Johannes Schoeman. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Bernice Serfontein, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Imagination, Religion and Morality, an Interdisciplinary Approach, prepared under my supervision. In her thesis, the promovenda investigated the origin of religious awareness and morality by means of an interdisciplinary approach, combining theology with evolutionary biology and philosophy. The thesis proposes that a more comprehensive understanding of the distinctive human imagination, religious awareness and morality will facilitate from a bottom-up view a more responsible understanding and practice of ethics. Her research combined a niche construction perspective with fossil and archaeological evidence, highlighting the role of complexity in human evolution, which adds to our understanding of a completely human way of being in the world. By creatively integrating the various perspectives evident in her study, by way of a philosophical breach theory between evolutionary anthropology and theology, the promovenda drew the insightful and far-reaching conclusion that evolutionary thought can be constructively appropriated to interdisciplinary Christian theology and ethics. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree, Doctor of Philosophy, with all associated rights and privileges on Bernice Serfontein. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Sebastian van Dijk, who has compiled with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Post-Apartheid Racism Among Afrikaans-Speaking Urban Adolescents, a Narrative Pastoral Reflection, and it was prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the promovendus investigated the seemingly increasing occurrences of racism among post-apartheid Afrikaans-speaking urban adolescents in South Africa. The dialogue, spiritual values, and awareness levels of participants were explored. An attempt was made to come to a better holistic understanding of the history of racism in South Africa. The research indicated how Afrikaner adolescents sometimes live life unquestioned from a position of power that was culturally inherited. Consequently, this thesis advocates for an approach of subjective awareness in building relationships. In such a context, people can feel and share their own vulnerability and shame, have fears, but also gain trust to contribute to meaningful dialogue with others. A framework of acceptance and being vulnerable can make a significant contribution towards a racism-free environment. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Sebastian van Dijk. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Lizette Matilda van Rooyen, who has complied with all the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled A Practical Theological Reflection on Discipline, Listening to the Voices of Children and Parents. She prepared this under my supervision. In her thesis, the promovenda investigated, by means of qualitative, post-foundational, practical theological narrative inquiry, the influence their religion has on the way parents discipline their children. It traced the history of theologians across time on the theology of the child. It also engaged in a dialogue with interdisciplinary experts from educational sciences and the social sciences to enrich the study and thicken the research narrative. This brought to light the effects the turn of 1994 had on the discipline, on different parenting styles and discipline techniques, and a discussion on corporal punishment. It is a multi-religious study, including African, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian religions. The research found that discipline has a definite role to play in the shaping of children, with the potential to have even more of a positive influence. Mr. Chancellor, I request you now to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all associated rights and privileges on Lizette Matilda van Rooyen. Congratulations. This is okay.
Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Divinity. Mary Berg, with distinction. Frederick Kutziel. Hendrik de Lange. Thomas Dreyer. Jan-Marie Dutoit. Anna Els. Mone Jacobs. Jana Kloot. Regina Koch, with distinction. Andre Meyer, with distinction. Luna Polly, with distinction. Peter Waldo, Pretorius. Natasha Smith, with distinction. Larissa Stradom, with distinction. Marie-Louise Trollope. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Philosophy in Applied Theology. Paulus Platkis. Andre Smuts. Masters in Church History and Church Polity, Manyane Intai, with distinction. Pekek Intali. Masters in Dogmatics and Christian Ethics, Willem Pretorius. Dogmatics and Christian Ethics, John Charles Stay, with distinction. Roger Tem in New Testament Studies, with distinction. Johann Stolz in Old Testament Studies, with distinction. Mafamani Shabalala, with specialization in practical theology. Modisa Kabosele in practical theology. Nkosanathi Mbata, with distinction in practical theology. Tiago Rabalalo, in practical theology. That's fine. Dekaledi Rashakanyana, practical theology. Adam Sagone, practical theology. Alvis Sibia, in practical theology. Semala Shabalala, in practical theology. John Chisi, in practical theology. Marco Lagrange, Practical Theology with distinction. Masio Makata in Practical Theology. Motsepo Mokane, Practical Theology with distinction. Safiso Nkobo in Practical Theology. Tseko Temane in Practical Theology. Tokozani Twala in Practical Theology. Faye van Eden, Practical Theology with distinction. With specialization in Science of Religion and Missiology, Isaias Face, Science of Religion and Missiology. Refole Balayo. The following students have complied with the degree of requirements of Bachelor of Theology Honors, Dogmatics and Christian Ethics. Harris Majeke, Dogmatics and Christian Ethics. Takatso Sedidi, Dogmatics and Christian Ethics with distinction. Given Shaluke, Dogmatics and Christian Ethics with distinction. Letabo Molapanya, New Testament Studies with distinction. Kenalamang, Old Testament Studies. Fokase, Practical Theology. Imtobi Jitta, Practical Theology. Fani Kuzawayo, Practical Theology. Tabo Madiba, Practical Theology. Sabata Mokele, Practical Theology. Nomatema Msipa, Practical Theology with distinction. Sibongizi Zeni, Msomi, Practical Theology with distinction. Ivor Swartz, Practical Theology. Brendan Ash, Science of Religion and Missiology. Lennox Maobe, Science of Religion and Missiology. Mosemaneke Gape Meno, Science of Religion and Missiology. Fulani Mkizi, Science of Religion and Missiology. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the postgraduate diploma. Mvuyo Dick, Gaborone Letsito, Faith Imnizi, Vuzimuzi Nkuna, Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Arts in Theology. Alfred D.B. Letlagonolo Insela. Enoch Simalane. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Divinity. Erika Barnard, with distinction. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Theology. Peter Devendish. Natasha Duplessis. Leander Fourie. Samukeldiswe Kanyela, with distinction. Lynette Lotter, with distinction. Olga Ludwig, with distinction. Nola Malan, Amfile Marumbo. Pino Moncho. Marcelo Moshabela. Joshua Imwani. Godse Inkoaneane. Monique Pasha, with distinction. Alan Kwashkapabiri, with distinction. Judy Platkes, with distinction. Anushka Smith. Elizabeth Stein, with distinction. Johannes van de Venter. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the University Diploma in Theology. Dorothy Makalefa. Warren Sharp, with distinction. Shimalani Tabela. Simone van Skalkbeek, with distinction.
I now request the Dean to introduce to me the candidate for the presentation of the award of the Vice-Chancellor and Principal.
Mr. Chancellor, I have the honor to introduce you to Ms. Erica Barnard for the presentation of the award of the Vice-Chancellor and Principal. Erica Barnard complied with all the requirements for the Bachelor of Divinity degree on 30th of November 2018, and the degree was conferred on her today with distinction. She distinguished herself during 2018 as the overall top achiever in the Faculty of Theology and Religion. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to present the candidate with the award of the Vice-Chancellor and Principal.
I hereby present Erica Barnard with the award of the Vice-Chancellor and Principal. Congratulations, ma'am. Well, we have come to the end of the proceedings. I think it's time to congratulate ourselves. Let's give the graduates a big round of applause. Now we would like the graduates to applaud their families, friends, and spouses for their support. Well, again, thank you to everyone. Thank you. Another very successful graduation. I thank the Faculty of Theology for the work done and for the excellent results. It's always very comforting to see so many new graduates going out. We have many challenges out there. So when we have got more brains that have been prepared to face these challenges, it's very fulfilling indeed. Thank you and our best wishes. Now we've come to the end of the proceedings. Before we close, I wish to invite all present for refreshments afterwards in front of this hall. Now you are requested to stand for the singing of the national anthem and to remain standing until the assembly has been dissolved and the academic procession has left the auditorium. Please stand. By the power vested in me, I hereby dissolve this congregation of the University of Pretoria. Thank you very much.
Say